Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to the Utility Leadership Academy and Energetic Women webinar, Building Strengths versus Fixing Weaknesses, sponsored by CenterPoint Energy. My name is Stacy Bonine, and I'm the Director of Corporate Services with MEA. I also have Shannon Miller here with me, who is the Program Manager of Utility Leadership Academy.
We are very fortunate today to have world-renowned leadership development expert, best-selling author, executive coach, and sought-after speaker, Dr. Jack Zenger. Before we introduce Dr. Jack Zenger, we have just a few announcements to go through. First off, as attendees, you are all muted. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And if we don't get back to you during the webinar, someone from Zenger Folkman will be sure to follow up with you shortly after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on both the Energetic Women and ULA websites by end of day tomorrow.
We would like to thank CenterPoint Energy for the sponsorship for the webinar today. And I'm just going to quickly read CenterPoint Energy's vision, which is to be recognized as America's leading energy delivery company and more. We know that reliable energy is not a luxury. It's up to us to keep the lights on and to provide clean, natural gas for homes, factories, and businesses. Our long tradition of dedication and hard work adds up to a company of people who are always there for our customers and neighbors, for our employees and their families, and for our shareholders. So thank you to CenterPoint for your generous support in helping in bringing Dr. Jack Zenger in for this webinar. Additionally, we are excited to announce that each attendee at today's webinar will receive a complimentary Zenger Folkman online leadership self-assessment. Also, each person who fills out a webinar evaluation will be entered to win one of 3 books titled The Extraordinary Leader, co-authored by Dr. Jack Zenger himself. We will repeat this again at the end of the webinar, but if you are viewing this webinar as a group, please contact Shannon or myself via email to receive your own personal self-assessment and evaluation.
We have a few very important upcoming programs between the ULA and Energetic Women. The ULA has our upcoming webinar on identifying safe employees in March to include discounted access to an online safety assessment. Also, keep an eye on the MEA calendar for the April ULA webinar titled Characteristics of Effective Leadership for Utility Team Building, and for a special leadership development event in the fall, we are considering partnering with Zenger Folkman to provide our members. So if you like today's content, we're going to be hanging out in the fall again, most likely.
The Energetic Women's 7th Annual Conference is coming up June 10th through 12th in Denver, Colorado. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and topics, and the leadership team has worked hard on making this conference even bigger and better than last year. We've added a kickoff and session to the front end of the program and are excited to see everyone this year in Denver. And now let's get on with the webinar. We would like to introduce Dr. Jack Zenger. Dr. Zenger is the co-founder and CEO of Zenger Folkman, a professional services firm providing consulting, leadership development programs, and implementation software for organizational effectiveness initiatives. He is considered a world expert in the field of leadership development and is a highly respected and sought-after speaker, consultant, and executive coach. And with that, we would like to welcome Dr. Jack Zenger.
Thank you very much. What a great pleasure to be with you today to talk about, I hope, a topic of really great importance to all on the call. I want to begin by talking about some research that has been done regarding your industry. So PricewaterhouseCoopers some time ago published a study having to do with the energy and utility industries and said one of their findings was that companies in this industry were in the process of losing many of their long-term key workers. Now, that's not unusual in today's world. We know that certainly on the managerial side, for most big organizations, roughly half of their upper middle management and senior executives are eligible to retire in the next 5 years. What was particularly a little bit alarming, though, was in the data from 2012 compared to 2010, the number of executives who were eligible for retirement in your industry jumped from 43% to 63%. And so as you think about that and you think about the implications that has, the creation of a leadership pipeline is clearly something that we all need to think about. Added to that, the study said that the generous retirement packages that the industry has traditionally offered may encourage retirement, particularly as we head into more favorable economic times. And that the combination of all these trends will potentially kind of reduce overall employee productivity. So with that backdrop, kind of painting the broader picture, let me talk about leadership development as we see it. The fundamental assumptions behind most leadership development programs kind of begin with the fact that every leader can get better. Now, that's a particularly important issue, I think, because there's some kind of interesting research that says if you have executives that don't believe people can get better, if they believe that your capabilities are pretty much fixed by the time you're 15 or 16 years of age, and it used to be kind of our old view of intelligence, that intelligence was relatively static and didn't change. The later research is that people get smart, and they're not born smart. And so as it comes to leadership, it's very important that we help all people who are responsible for developing leaders to kind of really have this belief that everybody can get better. The second thing is that we have a fundamental belief that people benefit from having a personal development plan. We tend to do things that we plan and we are thoughtful about pursuing. And the final kind of pillar, I guess, of leadership development in most firms is that when you have people focus on a large number of things that they're supposed to do, they end up not doing anything. But when they are very riveted on 2 or 3 key things, then the likelihood of them doing something about those goes significantly up. So let's talk about one question that usually arises, and that is when leaders decide to put together a plan of development, they often face one large question. They're given some data that says, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses. Should I work on overcoming my weaknesses, or should I magnify something I'm already reasonably good at? Interestingly enough, we found that the majority of leaders kind of gravitate toward fixing a weakness. And I'd like to kind of ask you all this question as you're here on the call. In your experience, what do you find leaders working on? Do you find them, or number one, correcting some weakness? Do you, B, find them working on some combination of weaknesses and strengths? Or do you see them kind of fundamentally try to identify their strengths and focus on them? So I would invite you all to kind of weigh in with your answer to those 3 questions. Okay, it looks like the majority of you are saying that people work on some combination of weaknesses. That only about 20%, 19% work on magnifying their strengths, and that a little more than a fourth, 28%, work on correcting some weaknesses. Well, thank you. That's a very helpful backdrop for our discussion as we go forward. Let me just do one follow-up question to that. To what degree do you think that this decision that you just kind of noted was one that was kind of deliberately considered, or do A, people assume that they're supposed to work on a weakness? B, do they just say, well, I never thought about it, I was not aware it was ever discussed or considered? It was thought about. Number C, that, the leader thought about it and they deliberately chose to work on something that they weren't very good at, or they thought about it and they chose to work on a strength, or finally, it was considered and the leader chose to do a combination of those things. So maybe just a little more specific about how they came to that decision. So looks like nearly a half assume that's what you're supposed to do. And the others are kind of all pretty much equal. The last one, it was considered and the leader chose a combination of things, is the second highest response. So only maybe 12 or so percent thought about it and deliberately chose to work on a strength. Well, I'll hope that by the end of our session together here today, maybe some of you will have some new thoughts about what's the optimum thing for me to do. So I want to go back to this, the pillars of a leadership development effort. Our data would say that less than 10% of leaders that we encounter in most organizations have any kind of a plan for their own development. Now, we have plans for annual meetings and for conferences we hold, and we have plans for, relocating an office. But when it comes to my own personal development, only 10% have anything close to that. We've observed that when it comes to personal development, that leaders often kind of see this as being something that is kind of a trade-off with getting their job done, So, and if there's ever a collision between me getting my work done and me spending some time on my personal development, it seems like work always trumps the personal development. It gets put on the back burner. There's no systematic way to go about doing it. So we also know that without some kind of a plan, there's not very much happens, and particularly regarding this fundamental issue, whether you work on strengths or weaknesses. The answer about working on strengths and weaknesses is a little bit complex because it depends a bit on the person's skill level, and it can vary over time for the same person. So we're going to dive into kind of trying to answer this question in a little more specific kind of way for all of you. We're fortunate in that we begin with a large database. So my colleague Joe Folkman had for many years, before we began this organization some 10 years ago, he had been processing 360-degree feedback for a variety of consulting companies and for a variety of large corporations. We had data on about 11,000 managers. We had about 110,000 at the time 360-degree feedback reports. Just as an aside, that number now is more than 500,000, and we have probably 50,000 managers now in our database. But at the time we did this specific piece of research, we looked at the question of, so what kind of pattern do we see with leaders? What percent of leaders have what we would call a serious weakness? And we'll just kind of arbitrarily define a serious weakness as something that's, down in the lower 10 percentile. So what percentage of leaders have any one competency that's down in that kind of bottom 10 percentile? And so I would invite you all to kind of quickly weigh in here. Is it 0 to 14%? And you see them all up there. And thank you. You're all kind of weighing in very speedily and promptly here. And it looks like that the most prevalent guess is the middle one, 30 to 44%, closely followed by 15 to 30%. Well, thank you very much for doing that. The data that we have would indicate that as you look at leaders, that you see this interesting kind of phenomenon. They fall into about 3 groups, and they fall pretty equally into those 3 groups. One group has one or more faults. That is, they have one competency or behavior that's down at the bottom 10%. A second third has neither a fault nor any great strength. And then finally, there's a group of people who have one or more strengths. And they're roughly a third and a third and a third. And so what's interesting is that 2% of leaders have both a strength and a weakness, but you can see that's a fairly kind of rare occasion. Only 2% would have that combination. So what's important, I think, for everyone on the call to understand is that these three groups are perceived quite differently by their colleagues. So as you look at their overall 360-degree feedback data, what you see is that group who had a flaw but with no accompanying strength, overall they were perceived as being at the 18th percentile. Then that middle group that had a flaw, had no flaw, but also didn't have any strength, as you would guess, they're kind of seen as being pretty average. They were kind of right in the middle. And then that group who possessed one or more strengths, not accompanied by a flaw, were at the 81st percentile. And this, I think, is really an important understanding, is that it is because people possess strengths that they are perceived as really being very, very effective in the organization, not because simply they didn't have any flaws, but it is really the presence of strengths that takes them there. Our conclusions from analyzing all this information is, if when you become aware of your results on a 360-degree feedback instrument, certainly working on a weakness makes sense if there is some fault that is seriously diminishing your performance. But what happens is that working on a flaw does get you to ground zero, but it doesn't get you beyond that. If you looked at a continuum of performance from fatal flaws to overall all the way over to strength, working on a fatal flaw does kind of bring you up to ground zero. But when you work on a strength, it can really raise you above ground zero. So the challenges in working on a weakness, I think, are these. Leaders have a kind of murky view of both their weaknesses and strengths. Maybe you've heard, as I have, people say, "Oh, I know what I'm good at, and I also know my weaknesses." I'm here to say to you that based on our looking at hundreds of thousands of 360-degree feedback instruments, that as a rule, leaders don't know either their weaknesses, nor do they know their strengths very well. And once having had their weaknesses maybe pointed out to them, they often don't know what to do to correct that weakness. They sometimes lack the motivation to fix that weakness. Sometimes that working on a weakness can involve a certain amount of drudgery, particularly if it involves activities that the leader doesn't like. And it nearly always requires creating some new feedback process, and it means creating some support mechanisms to bring them there. Now, maybe you might be interested in kind of knowing what we've found out about this thing called fatal flaws. So, and I'm kind of getting stuck here on my slides here. So my helper here needs to let me move forward on my slides. Okay. We often think of somebody having a fatal flaw as someone like Steve Carell in the television program called The Office. We think of somebody who is just really a bumbling, inept, insensitive, kind of boorish kind of guy, usually a guy. Or we think of, kind of the classic miserable, rotten boss who screams and shouts and pounds the table and demands things instantly and is just, really obnoxious. What's fascinating is that's not what our data shows at all. Those actually are fairly rare characters. What we found is that the 10 most frequent fatal flaws are, and I'm putting them up on the screen now, and you can read them. I won't read them to you. But I'd ask you to just for a moment, as you read through that list, kind of ask yourself, so what is that they have in common? What is it that they're describing? And let me give you a moment to do that. But let me offer to you my view. What we see here is not a picture of the really obnoxious, miserable, unreasonable, pound the table, swear, berate people kind of leader. It isn't so much things that they are doing as it is the things that they're not doing. And it seems to me that this list describes a lack of, an unwillingness to, and kind of tolerating mediocre performance, not providing clear vision and direction, not building kind of trust within their people. And so what we've found is that sometimes people who have a flaw aren't aware of it because they say to themselves, well, I don't do those terrible things that you hear about bad bosses really doing. What they don't realize is it's that they're not doing the things that their subordinates really need them to do, and hence these become the 10 most frequent fatal flaws. Let me talk about the allure of working on a weakness. We're well aware that there's a certain attraction to that, and a number of you said, a good quarter of you said that that's where you would go. Perfection's a laudable target. We all like to think that we could be perfect. We have all kind of grown up revering this Renaissance person who is good at everything. And so if I discover that I'm not good at something, then clearly what I want to do is to fix that so that I can hopefully be perceived as being good at everything. Maybe it's because our educational systems have operated with that premise. We get report cards on our kids who go to school, and in those early grades, the teacher is marking their performance on everything, whether it's mathematical, whether it's linguistic, whether it's artistic, whether it's whatever. They're expected to be kind of all-round good. It isn't okay to be just good in some things and not good on others. But whatever it is that sort of is combined, we sort of have this pattern that, and a number of you pointed that out. We just thought that was what you were supposed to do, that you just work on a weakness. Now, the rewards of working on a weakness are these. A small amount of progress is often noticed. When you point out a weakness that you're working on, others are usually kind of eager to jump in and help you. We see periodically examples of people who have identified their weakness and they really are good at working on it. And I don't have the data here to kind of show you right now, but we've got some data that shows that when people do work on their weaknesses, they make some really wonderful progress at it. They're really good at jumping forward. But despite the fact that it's personally kind of rewarding, we would point out to you that there's a certain futility in seeking to be perfect. With the explosion of knowledge and technology, it makes being perfect at everything virtually impossible. And therefore, our message to all of you on this call today is, in general, and for the great majority of you, we would argue that it's really best for you to identify what your strengths are and work on magnifying those. Now, that makes sense when there's no serious weakness that gets in your way. So again, I want to reiterate, if you believe you have a serious weakness, or if you've had some data from a 360-degree feedback process, or from a performance review or whatever, that tells you, yeah, there's something about me that really does detract from my performance, then by all means, work on that. No question. But if that weakness is not something that's mission critical, and it's not detracting from your performance, if that weakness kind of has been relatively remedied, then we encourage you to work on strengths. Now, there's 2 points of view about strengths, and let me ask you, if you would, to kind of respond to this quick little poll. One point of view says, the more you have of a strength, the better you are. It's that kind of you can't be too rich or too beautiful kind of point of view, perspective. Or there's also a second point of view that says, well, a strength carried too far can become a weakness. And so I would invite you all to kind of respond in one of 3 ways. If you lean toward number 1, kind of indicate that you can't have too much of a strength. Or number 2, I think strengths can be carried too far. Or maybe both seem correct to me. You're a mugwump, that classic bird that has his mug on one side of the fence and his wump on the other. So let's just see. So 30% of you are saying, I lean toward you can't have too much of a strength. More than half of you, 55%, are saying strengths can be carried too far. And 15 say, well, I think both seem correct to me. Okay. So let me tell you about our point of view on this, and let me express kind of what our research would say. Our research would say that free me up here. Maybe we need to start by saying, what is a strength? We believe that a strength is some attribute or quality that cuts across a wide variety of situations. It lasts over time, it produces good outcomes, tends to be valued in its own right. We think the people that have been most articulate and have been the best researchers about this whole notion of strengths are those who are kind of saying that this is the fundamental kind of basis of a strength. That one strength doesn't diminish another. So simply because you have one, it doesn't sort of detract. It's usually built on a natural ability, or it can be something that's developed by very intensive, deliberate practice and effort. And so strengths, there may be a strength that people have which seem to come kind of naturally to them. There's also a lot of strengths that people develop which there was no evidence that they had any kind of proclivity toward that. We would define a strength as something that you're really good at. It's something that you would score at the 90th percentile or above as measured through the perception of others. And usually there maybe are some institutions or some rituals, and there may be some role models, maybe even some parables in our culture that would support this strength. Now, it's really important to kind of pay attention to this definition, because I think if you understand our definition of what a strength is, it does help to resolve this big controversy. So let me just say what the debate is, and we've already kind of alluded to it. There is this debate that says strengths can be carried too far. And 2 people that I know, fellows named Kaplan and Kaiser, have published an article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago called Stop Overdoing Your Strengths. And they've written some subsequent books on that topic. And their argument is basically this. They would divide leadership behavior into 2 kind of broad categories, two kind of buckets. And one bucket would be labeled forceful behavior. This is the behavior of the leader who takes charge, decides, pushes, really gets things done. Or the second bucket would be what they would describe as enabling behavior. That this is a person who's very empowering of others, listens to others, is very supportive of others. And they would argue that, look, you all probably know people who are too forceful. Is it possible to be too forceful? Absolutely. And the person who's highly aggressive and assertive takes charge at every moment and every time, makes all the decisions, pushes people, there's clearly evidence that that person begins to have less and less effective results. And they turn people off, and people kind of avoid them, and their effectiveness goes down. Similarly, people who are good listeners and supportive, a certain amount of that's really good. But if they do it too much, if they won't make a decision, and if they won't ever kind of provide sort of any kind of clear leadership, then their effectiveness goes down. So, if you define leadership as forceful behavior or enabling behavior, then I think there's no question that too much of either one of those is not a good thing. Our disagreement with that point of view is we don't think those are strengths. I didn't ask you the question, does that ring true with your experience? And I hope that it does, and I'm assuming that it does. The other side of the debate is we don't believe that forceful and enabling behaviors, we think those are tactics, those are some behaviors, but they're not strengths. They don't always produce good outcomes. They're not valued in their own right. Using one diminishes the other. There's no institutions or rituals or role models and parables to support them. And that's why we have this very strong position that you working on a strength can keep working on it, can keep getting better on it, because what we've defined as a strength are things like character, problem-solving skills, technical competence, taking initiative, being focused. You can read them. And my question to you would be, can you envision somebody having too much integrity? Can you imagine having a boss who was too honest? Can you imagine somebody to be too good at problem solving? Would you not want to have a colleague who was technically competent? Are you concerned that the more technically competent they got, the less effective they would be? And what we would say is that all of our data says the more of each of these competencies that a person displays, the better results they produce. And the less of that competency they display, the less effective they are as a leader, as seen through the eyes of their subordinates, their peers, and their boss. That when you define these as the strengths of leadership, that you simply can't have too much of those kinds of strengths. We came to that list in a specific way. We didn't stand back and say, what do we think a good leader is? Let's just kind of make a list of what we deem to be the important attributes of a good leader. We began with a list of some almost 2,000 items from various 360-degree feedback instruments. And we approached this in a very empirical, statistical kind of approach. We said, which of these competencies separate high performers from low performers? There's lots of competencies there. You and I could sit down and make a list of some 70 wonderful attributes that a human being should possess, but not all of them make a big difference in terms of a leader's effectiveness. And so these were arrived at empirically, statistically, by looking at which ones make the biggest distinction between high and low performers. We simply would argue you can't have too much of those. Whatever side of the argument you end up on, though, let me just say there needs to be some balance. And so now I'd like to ask you one more kind of question. You've got a leader A. She is very passionate about obtaining results from 360. And she, based on her 360-degree feedback, she learns that some colleagues are put off by the fact that she's got this very strong drive for outcomes. Now, my question to you is, so what advice would you give this leader? Would you say to her, ignore your critics. Don't change anything. They're a bunch of wimps. Or would you say B, reduce your expectations about results to be achieved, kind of tone it down, moderate your drive for results? Would you say, well, do both at kind of half throttle, kind of focus on relationships to some degree and focus on results to some degree, but sort of do them both halfway? Would you say D, keep all your focus on results, but, to that, add some further attention on building good relationships? Or would you say E, put all your attention on relationships, let your focus on results take care of themselves? So what do you think? All right, let's see here. So an overwhelming percentage of you, and it's now about 80%, say the D option. Keep your focus on results and add some attention to building relationships. And let me congratulate you all. I think you have all come up with what we believe to be the right answer. What we would say if we were coaching a leader in this position is, look, your success to date has been based on the fact that you were very focused on results. Don't suddenly back off from that, because that's what got you where you are. What it does appear is that you could do a little bit better job of kind of balancing a little more attention on building relationships, and so keep your focus on that. So we would agree with what most of you kind of selected as the ideal option. All right. Now, how do you go about discovering your strengths? Contrary to what some may have suggested, we don't think it's through introspection. It isn't by reading Cosmo and taking one of their little quizzes that they have periodically in there. Our experience is that people aren't very good at just kind of sitting in the lotus position and kind of humming and saying, now let's see, what am I really good at? Just so you'll know, our data shows that self-perceptions or self-scores about what am I good at, what am I not so good at, are probably the least correlated with the total score that someone gets on a 360. If you kind of say that total score is combined of my direct reports perceptions, my peers' perceptions, the perceptions of my boss, maybe some perceptions of customers and suppliers, people I work with. But if you put those all together, my self-score is probably the least correlated with the total score in comparison to my manager scores or my direct report scores or my peer scores. They're about half as accurate as the manager or the peer or direct reports. We strongly feel that the 360-degree feedback process is the process that brings to you an objective, external view, data coming from differing directions, and hence the name 360, and useful perspectives, and that when you bring those all together, that does give you the best, the most accurate view of your strengths as a leader and any weaknesses that may be getting in your way. What we've learned is, and we said this earlier, that there are a number of people that don't have any strengths. There are people who have one strength. There are people who have 2 to 5 strengths. There's a certain number of people who have 6 or more strengths. But it is when people develop strengths that they really make their biggest contribution to the organization. So our encouragement to everyone is get your data, look at the things that if you don't have anything at the 90th percentile right now, then find the things that you've got that are at the 75th or the 60th percentile. Select 1 or 2 of those to work on. Make that your focus of development. That's the way that you can magnify that into being one of your signature strengths. As we've said, and as we've learned from our own data here today, the majority of leaders are not inclined to start there. That isn't where they've typically kind of focused. About 60% of leaders, again, left to their own devices, would work on fixing a weakness. And as I hope you've kind of comprehended from kind of what I've said, is that's about twice as many as you would expect, and twice as many as probably who should do that. About a third may very well want to kind of identify that weakness and work on that. But the rest of us, the rest of you, should be focused on, what am I reasonably good at and how do I get much better? Now, do they choose weaknesses because they believe that, I was blessed with a certain number of strengths and kind of they'll take care of themselves? And so real development, manly, womanly development is really about fixing weaknesses. And, I don't know what the source of that attitude, that philosophy is, whether it's the way we were raised as kids, whether it was our educational system does that to us. Could it be our upbringing, our culture in general? Those of you who are familiar with a very wise management guru named Peter Drucker, Peter Drucker said many years ago that he thought it was kind of unusual to the North American culture that we were so preoccupied with identifying our weaknesses and working on those. But it was Peter Drucker who back, 50, 60 years ago said the whole purpose of management is to build organizations that leverage people's strengths and make their weaknesses irrelevant. And so we just would strongly urge you all to kind of think about, how do I find out what are my strengths, and then how do I kind of leverage those? The history is that, as I said earlier, Peter Drucker talked about this 50 years ago. A guy named David Cooperrider introduced the idea of what he called appreciative inquiry, which was from an organizational viewpoint, rather than always kind of focusing on what are we doing badly, what are our mistakes, what are our weaknesses. Cooperrider said, why don't you stand back and look at what do we do well? What are our successes? And about 10 or 12 years ago, a fellow named Marcus Buckingham wrote a book called Now Discover Your Strengths. It was focused on individual contributors. And but he kind of helped to kind of launch this movement toward getting away from always focusing on people's weaknesses. Our research that was published in a book called The Extraordinary Leader, we began this research back in the year 2000, concluded that extraordinary leaders are absolutely defined by the strengths they possess and not very much by their weaknesses. This discovery comes, not from kind of invention. It simply comes from analysis of a large body of data. Our evidence says this, that if a person possesses no strengths, they're at the 34th percentile. If they possess one, they're at the 64th percentile. It doubles. If they possess two, it's at the 72nd percentile. And then you kind of see it just going up kind of gradually there from there on. So what this message says, kind of very loud and clear, is being an extraordinary leader isn't something that you arrive at because you're devoid of any weakness. It isn't that you get there by being kind of generally good at virtually all the competencies. It's the place you get when you're really good at a relatively small number of things, and when you get 5 of them, you're at the 90th percentile. When you get 3 of them, you're at the 80th percentile. So we think the great joy of working on strengths is that when you stop and think about it, it is appealing. It is reinforced by all the empirical evidence that we have. It is certainly reinforced by the fact that the greater the number of strengths, the more effective the leader. And let's face it, it's just a heck of a lot more fun to work on strengths than to work on things you're not so good at. Now, we've written a subsequent book. It's called How to Be Exceptional. And that book was really about, so once you've identified your strengths, are there some things that you can do to acquire them, to build on them? And again, this goes back to this very early comment I made that as leaders in organizations, one of the important beliefs that we think you need to have is that people can get better. That you weren't born with a skill to play golf, but sometime in your life, if you're a good golfer, you decided to do that, and you went out, you kind of practiced. Maybe you had a coach that worked with you, but you acquired that skill. And as you think about any skill you've acquired, later in your life, whether it's tennis or golf or skiing or woodworking or playing the cello or the piano or whatever you do, strengths, abilities can be acquired, but it requires some deliberate effort. It requires some way that you get feedback that gives you information about, am I making progress? Am I making good progress? But we know that people can grow and they can develop at a remarkable speed if the conditions are right and if they're willing to kind of put in a little bit of practice. What we know about building strengths is that all the research says that the hours of practice that people put in is the key driver. And the good news is that you don't need to kind of think about doing this outside of work. That when we think about acquiring leadership strengths, everybody's job provides them with a very effective classroom or laboratory in which to practice and learn leadership strengths. So, for example, let's say one of the leadership strengths is building relationships. No matter what your job is, you can work on building relationships, whether they're with other departments or other kind of functions in the organization, or with customers, with suppliers. You can practice getting better at building relationships in virtually any job in an organization. We strongly believe that strengths can be acquired by almost any ordinary person who defines what that is and then is willing to put forth effort and practice to do it. There's a guy named Martin Seligman who's a very respected psychologist. He's written some wonderful books, one called Authentic Happiness. He was the president of the American Psychological Association, and he's kind of known as the father of the whole positive psychology movement. His quotation that we've put here on the screen, I believe that the highest success in living and the deepest emotional satisfaction comes from building and using your signature strengths. But notice that word building. You can build them. The good life is using your signature strengths in every day to produce authentic happiness and abundant gratification. Peter Drucker made the comment that it's far easier to move from a +5 to a +10 than it is to kind of move from kind of way down in ground zero. but it does require more than passive treatment. It requires, discovery, creation, practice, and it requires you taking some ownership for this new behavior. Martin Seligman again says, my favorite positive intervention is really to ask you to take a survey, then think about which of these strengths are the ones you own and how you might use them every day. And quite astonishingly, your own ingenuity and your desire to lead the good life take over from there, even if I step aside. And that has certainly been our experience as we've kind of witnessed people get feedback, decide to work on something, and pursue it in a very rigorous kind of way. So the steps to take are, getting accurate data about what your strengths are and how you can progress to the next level. Focus on topics that are important to the organization. We think that your choice of a strength to work on is sort of a combination of what am I basically good at, what am I excited about doing, what's my passion, and what does the organization need from me? And when you find the overlap of those three things, then you can really choose to work on that and make an important step in your own career advancement. That provides you with the incentive and the motivation to do that. And knowing that other people care about this topic makes a big difference. And we are very strongly encouraging people to think about repeated 360s over the years to give them updated, objective, accurate information about the progress that they're making. The good news is that we've looked at when leaders choose to work on their strengths versus do they focus on their weaknesses, what happens? The good news is that both groups get better. But notice that the group that focused on their strengths, and maybe a little bit of a kind of a combination of strengths and weaknesses, had significantly more growth in their post-test than. So you see the difference between the 77% of growth versus 46% effectiveness after a period of time. So our final observations, working on strengths kind of tripled the amount of change. There was this extending effect that we observed that not only did people get better at the thing that they worked on, but they got better on many other things as well, because a lot of these competencies are so highly intercorrelated. I was looking at a sheet of data just the other day, and the 16 differentiating competencies that we measure are statistically significantly correlated at the kind of 0.01 level of statistical significance. So our summary, if you are one of those roughly 1/3 of all leaders who possess a weakness, by all means work on that. If you're not, then working on and work on that until it's fixed. But once corrected, switch over to developing strengths. The more strengths, the more effective a leader you will be, and it's just a lot more fun to work on strengths than to work on weaknesses. Now, do we have any facility for getting questions? So I'd be delighted to kind of respond to any questions any of you have. If you want to type them in, and I'll do my best to kind of respond if I can. And so what is considered a fault? One person earlier in our day said, what's considered a fault? So it is something that is down in the lower 10 percentile. It is something that is, but if it's a fatal flaw, it is something that not only you get a low score on, but it is also something that is really important to your job. So, you may be a person that gets a lower score on building relationships, But if you're a quality assurance manager, building relationships may not be as important to you as if you were a sales manager or a manager in a different function. So anyway, that is the. And so the one person says, I'm surprised that relationship skills is not listed as one of the core competencies. The list you saw on the screen, Kimberly, was not a complete list. It was a partial list. And so the list of 16 absolutely includes several interpersonal skills, communication skills, being inspiring and motivating, building relationships, being collaborative and being a good team player. So interpersonal skills absolutely is one of those. You mentioned 70 strengths. I mentioned that you and I could probably make a list of 70 attributes. We typically measure 16 competencies, which we found that for most organizations were the competencies that truly differentiated high performers from those that were not so effective. We can send you that list of the 16 differentiating competencies. Okay, Clarissa asks, what is the correlation between employee productivity and the number of executives eligible for retirement? Well, my comment earlier about overall productivity declining, I guess, would be we know that effective executives produce better results in their organization. They produce better results because they're inspiring and they're motivating and they do impact the organization for which they're responsible. So I don't know that the retirement of an executive changes the instant personal productivity, but we know that in terms of organizational outcomes, in terms of employee engagement, in terms of customer satisfaction, in terms of turnover, when you lose an effective executive, those things tend to decline. So that's the relationship between losing effective leaders and the overall productivity level of an organization. If your organization does not embrace 360 reviews, how would you suggest to get some good feedback? Well, 360 is probably the most objective and the most economical way I know. I guess the second best is to just go around asking that question to people that you trust, and to pay particular attention to performance reviews and team building sessions that encourage open dialogue, can give managers some relatively accurate feedback, but the 360 is probably the most economical and the most objective that I know of. We'll do our best to answer these other questions that we don't have time to get to. So in the spirit of keeping on time, let me kind of turn it back to Shannon and just thank you that we would welcome the opportunity to work with you. These are the kind of things that we do, and so Shannon, we'll turn it over to you.
So once again, we would like to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Jack Sanger and CenterPoint Energy for today's webinar. Please visit www.midwestenergy.org for more webinar opportunities. We hope you all have a great day, and thank you.